In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you guys exactly how I create my online learning tutorials for Skillshare and YouTube. So I know that I do cover a lot about how much one can earn as a Skillshare teacher, as well as things like how to consider which topics to create courses about, but I've never actually done an in-depth explainer video in terms of what my process or workflow looks like from start to end. So this is that video. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Megs, and every week I release tech tutorials helping you do digital better. Before we get started with the meat of the video, please do consider subscribing to my channel as well as liking and commenting on this video. It really helps me grow. So in terms of how I go about filming YouTube videos, wow, it's been a journey. It really has been. I feel like I've tried all the different ways in which one can do this, and I've kind of got my process down pat. That being said, obviously it is a very subjective thing, so if there are things that you look at and think, oh my goodness, I wouldn't be able to do that, or that's not going to work for me, then of course there's always going to be an alternative. But this is meant to kind of form a framework in terms of how one can approach the daunting prospect of teaching online. So the first thing is all around scripting videos. So initially I was never one to script a video. I would simply sit with notes on my lap and I would memorize a paragraph or a couple of lines, say it to the camera, and then edit anything out where I was looking down. That is a little bit of a time-consuming exercise, especially if you're not a particularly strong editor. However, newer editing tools like Descript make it a whole lot easier. So I will link to them down below. Basically, that is a text-based editor which allows you to edit based off of a transcribed paragraph, as opposed to the traditional way of editing it out where you'd simply have to go and look for those gaps where you're looking down and then remove them manually. So the good news is it is getting easier. But in terms of my workflow, I do find that it's typically easier to script things. So for example, this video, I'm actually not scripted, but most of the time, particularly when it's Skillshare or something that's quite knowledge dense, as in I'm quoting facts or anything like that, then almost always I will have actually scripted the video. So how I do this is I either hop onto Word or onto Notion on my computer and I will type out a script. So the great thing about Notion is that it allows you to save templates. So specifically for YouTube, if you want to add things like a hook, what your standard intro is, an outro, and so forth, it's great for doing that. Most of the time though, I simply do it in Word. So that's going to allow me to simply type out my script, read it, reread it, maybe check it with a friend, and then go ahead and film that. In terms of how that actually looks, I have a very straightforward teleprompter that I bought off of Takealot. I think it was 1,000 Rand, which is probably like $100 or less. And that really allows me to read off a screen exactly what I'm wanting to say. And then once I'm happy with the scripting, I will use an app which is called Teleprompter. It is a premium app, but it is so well worth it. The reason why you need to use the premium version is if you're using a teleprompter, you actually need the mirror view in order for it to work. So just a bit of science behind that. But yeah, then you would simply work out at what pace you speak, because you need to obviously dictate how fast the teleprompter is going to go. The way that this works is it's a really low cost hack. You're using a teleprompter app on your phone and it's simply reflecting off a kind of Z-shaped contraption, which effectively the Z is actually what is being reflected, and then you're able to see it. There's a beautiful little black piece of cloth that also goes over it so that it's darker so that you can read it. The first couple of times you use a teleprompter, obviously it does come across quite unnaturally, specifically things like how quickly you're talking, the fact that you're not pausing, or maybe even the way that you're looking at the camera might appear a little bit different. Once you do get used to it, it's so worth it in terms of the editing time that it's going to take you to then actually crop out your ums or ahs, or really get to the point where you're happy with what you're saying. But I definitely would suggest that a teleprompter is one of the first things you invest in. Other thing that I would suggest investing in very first is a microphone. I use the Rode VideoMic Pro. As you can see, it's just sitting in my lap at the moment, but typically I have an overhead arm that sits above me, and that allows me to very easily record. And what you'll notice with online learning is people will put up with okay visual quality, but what they will not put up with is terrible audio quality. So definitely do be sure to be mindful of that, especially things like the echo in a room. The simplest way to get around that is through things like mattresses, carpets, duvets, or otherwise I actually ended up finding some really cool sound panels that I bought secondhand or Facebook Marketplace. So you really want to go low cost on that. The other tricks that you of course want to know is being mindful of framing as well as lighting. So I typically will sit either with a ring light or a halo light in front of me. Alternatively, I'm currently sitting with a window facing me. So that really helps me to make sure that the lighting is good and positive. Something that I do battle with in my current filming studio is I do have skylights, and although that sounds like a wonderful thing, because of the natural lighting, it does fluctuate quite substantially, particularly in a 20-minute video. So ideally, you wouldn't want to contest with that. You normally want to pick between artificial lighting or natural lighting and make sure that it's not on too cloudy of a day, that the clouds are ever changing. But as I say, the audio quality is really what's most important, and coming across as a competent and knowledgeable teacher, I think people are actually more forgiving than what you think they are. So once you have actually filmed your script and you are feeling semi-confident, you're then going to move into the editing phase. So this, of course, is going to trip a lot of people up because editing is not something that we were taught in school necessarily. So I did mention Descript as one of the key tools which I've recently been using just to take out ums, ahs, or longer gaps. But how I would historically have done it pre-using Descript is I would just hop into the editing software that I was busy with. So this has evolved with me. So I've actually done a course in Premiere Pro, which is part of the Adobe suite. I have also worked on iMovie when I was on a MacBook, and I'm currently working on Davinci Resolve. I think it's very much one of those debates where it's like Apple versus Android. Like, everyone is really going to have a preference in terms of how they like to edit. For me, I've definitely found that I would have suggested younger me to start on a simpler editing software like an iMovie or a Wondershare Filmora, which was also something that I tried on for a brief period of time, and then transitioning into the more kind of premium suite products like, for example, Davinci Resolve, or maybe Final Cut if that's your thing. But you don't want to be spending a lot of money on a skill that you may later outsource, or you might actually find that teaching online has a shelf life altogether, in which case you'll no longer need that software. So definitely go for the free options. What I do like about Davinci Resolve is the fact that it's completely free unless you want to upgrade to a premium version. I've been editing on the free version for about 2 years and I've never actually experienced many of its limitations. I believe it's more things like video effects and color grading where this comes into play, but certainly for the basic editing of a video tutorial, it has never held me back. So once I get onto Davinci Resolve, you can see that it is a little bit of an overwhelming kind of look and feel, but effectively you're only going to be working in one tab majority of the time, so that means it's a lot easier to kind of get your head around it. If you haven't used Descript to edit out the ums and ahs, normally what you'll do is a rough cut of the footage first and you will remove any pauses. What is one of the biggest time savers is actually doing this according to the audio waves. So you don't actually have to sit and watch what's happening. You can simply see from the audio waves where a tape is off and you can edit like that. The other thing that I do find is really helpful is using the marker tool. So this is present on almost any editing software. It allows you to drop markers. So what I use this for is, for example, splitting up my video into sections. If I'm teaching on Skillshare, probably splitting it up into chapters or segments that I'm actually going to work on. What that means is when you go into the footage after the fact, you can easily see what's been done and what still needs to be done. I'll even use markers if, for example, it's late at night. I drop a red marker to say, future Meg, pick up on this at this point. So that is really, really handy. With everything else, I keep it super simple. So I do not use a lot of overlays or transitions or anything like that. I like to have a high-ish production quality, but because volume is typically of the essence when you're getting started. You don't want to trip yourself up with an editing process that is going to take you weeks and weeks. So then what I'll typically do is drag in things like an intro song, an outro song, any kind of bedding track or backing track that you use frequently. You can drop that in. The other thing that I do like about Davinci Resolve is it's super easy to click onto other projects and then pull things like maybe sound effects or visuals like the subscribe button, which you have used in previous videos. The other tool that I use a lot at this point is Canva. There is a free version. I use the premium version. You do not need the premium version, but effectively this is going to allow you to create visuals that are on brand, that allow you to intersperse your video so that it's not just a long talking head thing. It's actually interspersed with useful bits of information, like maybe someone asking you a question and you just responding to it. So that visual diversity is also really going to help a lot. So one of the more complicated things that you will have to contend with when it comes to editing is dropping in screen shares. So you will either have a desktop view of what you were doing, or in my case, often I will have a mobile view, specifically if I'm teaching something like a WhatsApp for Business tutorial. So either I will have done it while I'm sitting and filming it and I'll just superimpose the two later, or I'll do it in the editing phase because it's a little bit quicker. I can listen to the voiceover and then follow it on my screen share. So the two tools that I'm using for that, on an iPhone, I will show you the way in which you can simply add the recording button. So this is literally a two-step process which allows you to record your screen forevermore. I then use AirDrop to download that MP4 file and I'll then drag and drop it onto the timeline. If you're on Android, there is a free app which I used to use, which is called A to Z Recorder, which allows you to do the exact same thing. Then when you're in your editing software, obviously you can either superimpose this onto a background that you've created on Canva, which I do sometimes do. Alternatively, you can just offset the mobile screen recording to the one side. And then from a desktop view, you can either have this fill up the full screen or maybe superimpose it into a laptop. So how I do the screen recording, I actually just using Windows' native functionality. But what I've noticed and what some of my students have also noticed is when they are doing this, sometimes it only records the main screen, if that makes sense. And if you, for example, have come across a pop-up, it doesn't always record the pop-up. So the way in which I would suggest you could move around that is to either use something like Zoom. So there are ways in which you can record your screen on Zoom, or not to be confused with the premium tool, which I used to use, which is called Loom. So Loom is a premium screen recording functionality, which is actually useful for a lot more than just videos. It's also a really cool collaborative tool if you're working across maybe different cities or different offices. The music that I'm using, I have been trying out Epidemic Sound, but my friend Maggie actually referred me to a different sound royalty-free platform, which I'm going to link down below as well, which is apparently a little bit cheaper than Epidemic Sound. But effectively, you of course want to be using royalty-free music so that it's not going to result in you getting copyright strikes on something like YouTube. Once I finish my editing process, I then start to think about my thumbnail, which I again create on Canva. I find this one of the most fun parts of the journey because it's creative in the way that you have to think about what are some of the other videos that are ranking for that particular set of keywords looking like, and then similarly from a course perspective, what are some of my competitors doing, how do they present on various marketplaces. So particularly if you're teaching on Udemy and Skillshare, this is one of the key determiners whether someone's actually going to take your course or not, so you don't want to put a lot of energy and effort into that. And then from a YouTube perspective, your click-through rate's ultimately going to dictate how many views your video gets, so it's also a really important thing to consider. The final step that I will mention is sometimes when you upload to these various online platforms, you do sometimes have compatibility issues with things like frame rates. I use a free converter which is called Handbrake, which I will also link to down below, which is going to allow you to make sure that it is in the right format that it needs to be. With YouTube, I don't do any of this, I just upload it as is. I then put my thumbnail over and above that, and I use my YouTube analytics to make sure that I'm publishing at the time when most of my audience are online. A lot of people will simply publish a video when it's ready, but of course that's not best practice. And similarly, from an online marketplace perspective, when you're teaching online, you want to make sure that it's in the time zone when the most people are online as well. So although this is a little bit vague because I'm trying to cater for everyone, no matter whether you're teaching on YouTube, Skillshare, or Udemy, and whether you're editing on Davinci, Final Cut, or iMovie, I really do hope that this video has been helpful. If you have any particular questions around my workflow, maybe how I use Notion in a little bit more detail, I can certainly share that. It's definitely not a perfect science for me. I'm not a kind of obsessive person. I do use Notion for planning at points, but some of the time I'm really just doing the stuff manually. I do think that when it comes to teaching online as a beginner, you want to make it as simple as possible so that it's not a scary undertaking. And just remember, you have got this. If I managed to work it out, so can you. So please do pop me any comments or questions down below, and I can't wait to see you in the next video so we can keep on doing digital better.